Here we are.
Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, first we have to give you a warning. Sterling is a history nerd, just like I am, and we were left unsupervised, so none of the shenanigans that happened is our fault. Now that that's out of the way, Sterling, do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers at home?
Sure. I've been a full-time science fiction writer since 1988. Published my first book and actually sold my first novella back in 84. I've read science fiction and fantasy since I was implausibly young, along with history and anthropology and archaeology and stuff like that. And I have to watch myself because my research can get out of hand. And I don't want to, like, turn a novel into a textbook, but it's always a temptation.
Yes, that was the hardest thing when I started writing fiction, was crossing over from writing the academic stuff, because they like a lot of, conjunctive clauses, and the more commas in a sentence and the more convoluted the structure, the more they liked it. And you send that to your fiction editor for the first time and they're like, what crack are you smoking? Fix this.
Yes, of course, reading science fiction and fantasy was a help with developing an acceptable style.
I believe it.
You pick up things like Poul Anderson once told me that if you wanted to make a scene vivid, you should use all the senses, not just sight, which is the one you naturally tend to do. No, cat, I'm not going to pay attention to you now. Not just sight, which is natural for humans because we're visually oriented, but things like taste, smell, physical sensations, and that sort of thing makes it much more vivid. And I picked up stuff like that from most of the authors I liked, either from their work or by talking to them, or both. And yeah, and I've always, one thing I've developed the habit of asking audiences is, how many of you have densely plotted, colorful daydreams on a continuing basis? And I was surprised at how many people don't, but every fiction author that I've ever talked to does. I mean, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah, I can see that. It's kind of crazy the more you get into the writing side of things. When I go to a bookstore now, I look down the aisle, I'm like, oh, I know that guy, I met that guy, I know her. And so it's crazy when you talk to some of the people that have been around just a little bit longer than you, and they start naming some of the classics, which you just like studied about in academic senses, because you might have met someone at the beginning of your career who now at this point would be considered legendary, right? It's crazy when you think about how you get to almost touch history when you can have met those people.
Yeah, well, I met Sprague de Camp.
Nice.
Talk books with him. And I suppose someday someone will say, well, I talked to Steve Stirling. Yeah.
For me, it was when I got to meet Robert Jordan. He spoke at my college English department, and so we got to do the meet and greet. And then everyone that was in the honors classes got to stick around for more private talks. Mm-hmm. That guy had a lot of opinions on books. It was interesting to hear him talk. That was when he was, at the beginning of his sickness before he passed. So I imagine before he was sick, he was even more of a kind of outgoing person based on what we saw.
Yeah, authors come in all varieties. A lot of us are introverts, some aren't.
And some fake it when they need to.
Yes.
I think I've heard them use the expression extroverted introverts.
You've got to be a shy exhibitionist to be a writer, actually. You're exposing aspects of your personality to everybody. And you're the way you see the world and that sort of thing. Although I do like Niven's Law. Have you ever heard it?
No.
Larry Niven made it up. He said there's a technical term for those who confuse the viewpoint or opinions or beliefs of a character in a story with those of the author of the story. This technical literary term is idiot.
I like that. I'm going to write that down for later.
Mm-hmm.
So the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we first found them. And so we actually met Steve through Bill Fawcett when he came on. He started giving us all these people, hey, you want to talk to this person or that person? And I said yes, and you were the first one that answered the email. So because Bill was pimping us out to everybody, but he was a lot of fun. So I'm glad he came on.
Bill's a great guy.
And I read his new GOG series, I think it's the Armor series. I forget the exact name of it, but I read book 1. Oh my goodness, amazing.
Yeah, he has lots of ideas. In fact, he gave me a couple of ideas for To Turn the Tide.
Really?
Yeah, we talked it over before I started writing it.
That's interesting. We'll have to come back to that, some of the ideas that you got from that. But before we do that, we wouldn't be the Blasters and Blades podcast if we didn't do the religion question. So are you ready for this?
Mm-hmm, sure.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
All three. I thought Firefly was the most accomplished in some respects. Star Wars was the most gripping in some other respects. And Star Trek was something I started in on at an implausibly early age. I think 9.
Okay. For you, did you start with any specific of the Trek stuff? Like, where did you start that universe?
Watching the original show. And by God, getting anything decent on the TV in Nairobi, Kenya in the 60s was hard.
I imagine.
One of the staples was Mission Station Choir singing European folk songs with a Kikuyu accent. Oh, God.
So it's almost as bad as NPR programming that, you can sometimes get, or the military, military channel where you get all their programming? Mm-hmm. So was it, like, if you watch Star Trek, the original stuff now, it looks hokey when you compare it to what's out there now as far as both plot and production value. When you were watching it at the time, did it feel as hokey, or was it more, oh wow factor?
No, it was entertaining, and I got into the spirit of things. But then I have a tendency to supply visuals myself inside my head when I'm watching visual media. So the obvious, ruled in overlay of the phaser bolts and that sort of thing didn't bother me. I got to admit, though, that modern CGI is just bee's knees.
Absolutely. I know I've read a lot of the Star Wars books, but I never read the Star Trek stuff. And I know one of the times we interviewed Kristen Catherine Rush, and she was telling me that there's so much good stuff out there that I'm missing. So that's one of the things I've been meaning to do is get set up with the library's ebook renter, because I do ebooks so I can magnify it. Curse of the brain damage, I need bigger print. So that's on my agenda, is to try some of the Star Trek novels. I'm told they're a lot better episodically than some of the episodes even.
Some of them are, some of them aren't.
Yeah, you
can't tell until you try.
Yes, Star Wars was like that. Some of them were like epically awesome. The Thrawn series, Republic Commando, X-Wing, the Red Squadron. Like, some of them were really good, and then others were like, okay. Mm-hmm. But they scratched the itch at the time, so we'll go with it.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
Not in the novelizations of the series. Favorite episodes, yes. I have a terrible time remembering titles. There was the one where they were transported in time back to the 1930s and had to act against someone who was preaching pacifism at the time, and they liked her, but it was going to have disastrous consequences. That was my favorite Star Trek. Star Wars, it was the original the original 3. Some of the much more recent ones are actually quite good too, but there was a deep valley in there.
I feel like every science fiction franchise at one point in time, they do an episode where they go back in time. And some of those episodes can be really kooky. Like, I know Stargate SG-1 went back to the 70s. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of hilarious to see, their take on like the hippie culture.
Yeah.
And I don't, well, maybe it was the 60s. I generically assume hippies and 70s, but I know it was like the peace and love era is what they were going for. It was definitely very interesting to watch these straight-laced military guys try to fit in with a bunch of stoners.
Yeah. I experienced the 60s in Time magazine because it didn't arrive in Nairobi at the time. So I was a bit startled when I came back because I'd gotten, different impressions of what was going on.
Yeah, it's
wasn't
interesting to read about too. Some of the
There wasn't nearly as much free love as I anticipated.
the curse of youth. All right, because we're polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
I would put Game of Thrones first. I know George. And Chronicles of Narnia isn't really comparable to either of them because it's a different genre, really. It's fantasy, but it's not the nitty-gritty, somewhat realistic fantasy that both The Wheel and Game of Thrones are. Yeah, George based the original Game of Thrones on on England during the Wars of the Roses, and he said to me once I wanted to show how a feudal system functioned, and I replied, George, the Wars of the Roses weren't how a feudal system functioned; they were how it slagged down.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's the goal with picking the options that we picked was both, obviously the 3 sci-fi, 3 fantasy, but we try to pick stuff that's across all of the mediums and is iconic enough that people will know of them. Mm. But there's so much good fantasy that never made it to the screen that we couldn't put, like the Shannara series. I could put that up there, but for those that only consume via video mediums or visual mediums, they're not going to maybe know about that. So it's balancing act.
Well, until recently, it was extremely expensive to do a lot of fantasy well. And that's going to change now. When AI really gets going, it'll be possible to make fantasy and science fiction much more cheaply.
Are you familiar with the Dust YouTube channel?
Yeah, vaguely.
They do a bunch of shorts and, sci-fi and fantasy, but they have a shoestring budget, and I would put a lot of what they do against modern Hollywood any day as far as the quality of the storylines. So like the cost to entry isn't what it used to be. So I do think you're right. We're going to see more. There's also a technology I saw. I want to say I made fun of NPR earlier, but there was like either NPR or BBC was doing a video about how movies are made now, and they had one example of some of the changing tech where it was all green screen diorama, and so you didn't actually have to go to the various locations to get the scenery you wanted anymore. You could bring the scenery to you on a soundstage, and it was actually really good as far as the quality it was putting out. Like obviously there's some glitches where it kind of superimposes over you, but once they figure that out completely, I mean, I think the movie magic is going to give them more opportunity to be more adventurous.
Yeah, there's going to be they're making really rapid progress with that stuff, and eventually it'll be indistinguishable from the real thing, of course, except that some things will be impossible.
Yeah, I don't know as we go forward that you're going to need something like a Hollywood anymore. I mean, the businesses might stay sort of headquartered there, but I don't think you're going to need to go to Hollywood necessarily. I think it's going to become more of a global market going forward, is my suspicion.
Yeah, although, it's like publishing. There's a lot more self-publishing these days. And on the one hand, that's good because you can get things in that just don't happen to hit any editor where they live. On the other hand, editors do perform a screening function, and that means screening out a lot of really awful stuff. I had a friend who was a slush pile reader.
Right.
And they composed a series of the most outre stuff they got. Not just, not very good, but Well, there was one about a series about a uh, child who was shipwrecked on one of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia and raised by the family goat. And to quote the description, being raised by the family goat had took its toll of him. And there was another, this was actually submitted to one of the major publishing houses, called The Organ, where a guy turned into a 6-foot penis in the middle of the night, and his wife rushed him to the hospital. And the head of the hospital found that the penis had a strange magnetic effect on people and plotted to use it to take over the county medical system. Not the world, just the county medical system.
That is a very unique premise.
Yeah, and there was another one about an undersized, it was a 600-page epic about an undersized paper bag from Louisville, Kentucky that had self-esteem problems because it was smaller than the other paper bags, so it set out to find itself.
Well, the good thing about indie publishing is your overhead is lower. Even if you do it professionally, you get a professional editor because you can outsource that nowadays. Get a professional cover, and your overhead is still lower than, say, what Tor, Bain, or anybody else would need. So you can get some of the more niche stuff that might not appeal to everybody. And I think that's a good thing. You serve the audience, where they are. I think a decent amount of mill sci-fi these days is indie published.
I just sold a book to Arc Manor.
Okay.
And I published a series back in the 90s, I think it was. The Sky People and in the Courts of the Crimson Kings. It was my tribute to the pulps, basically. It's set in an alternate universe in which Mars and Venus were terraformed 200 million years ago and turned out more or less the way the pulps were. Mars is a dying planet with ancient civilizations. Venus has dinosaurs and cave people. And I had a hoot with it, but they wouldn't take the third one. One of the editors there said, this is too much like science fiction. Yeah, but Arc Manor is doing the whole series, got the rights to the first two, and is doing the one I had planned for the third one, which is sort of a super pellucidar, a Dyson sphere inhabited on the inside.
Okay.
520 million times the surface area of Earth.
Is that Arc Manor, are they a small press or are they affiliated with one of the bigger companies?
They're a small press, but they do a lot of really good stuff. I've published with them. Harry Turtledove has a bunch of established authors with things you just couldn't move to the majors.
Yeah, I think some of the small presses out there are vanity presses, but there are really good ones. Like Athon is doing amazing things for sci-fi and fantasy. They've got a lot of lit RPG stuff. I know Three Ravens is doing some of the nostalgia GURPS properties that they're now writing fiction in. There's just a decent amount of them out there that are now reputable actual businesses. They're just smaller in scale.
Yeah.
I think that's a good middle ground of you can get the niche stuff out there, but still have some level of vetting.
Yeah, that's a very positive development because the majors have been consolidating at a furious rate for the last generation, and that's restricting both output and the chances of people getting published, which is not a good thing. I mean, God knows it was hard enough when I started out in the 80s, and it's gotten, as far as the majors are concerned, much worse since. But there are, as you say, niche publishers. There are ones that do quite well and have a fair amount of high-powered stuff, and it's a positive development. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, some of the horror, for instance, is very niche, but there are actual thriving horror small presses that publish nothing but, and they do okay. They feed their authors. So, yeah. I mean, that's not normally my thing, but that doesn't mean the people that read it don't want quality as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're right on that.
It's a changing market out there. I have noticed also that the taste of what they want, not quality, because that implies that what was written in the 80s and 90s is bad, but the tastes have changed, I think, like with what they want for descriptions and the style of prose. And I do think some of the smaller presses can adapt quicker, which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes not.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
um, I,
they can have more specialized markets and that sort of thing.
absolutely. So
Bainstar,
now,
niche publisher.
yeah, and they're doing all right for themselves if they say so.
Yeah, and they bought this new time travel series I'm doing, which was a good thing.
It looks interesting to me, so I'm already setting myself up to do the review for that for Upstream. So, all right. So one of our sponsors has the request that we fix the crying shame of adulthood, where people no longer ask you your favorite dinosaur. So, Mr. Stirling, what is your favorite dinosaur?
Triceratops. I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was a little kid.
So, were you a fan of Jurassic Park when it came out, either in written or the big screen?
Yes, I was. I thought they did the dinosaurs rather well.
Yeah, it was impressive. It still holds up too. Not all of the movies from the 90s aged well as far as effects, but that one still holds up.
Oh, yes, it does. Although the later ones, you keep thinking, why don't they just shoot them?
Because yeah, I get the trope is, well, we don't want to kill them because they're so majestic, but like they just ate your friend.
Yeah, exactly. The trouble is large, fierce animals are a solved problem. Africa is full of, was full of large, fierce animals. But you notice it's not the humans that are endangered there.
Yeah.
I mean, they've recently discovered that Neanderthals hunted cave lions. Cave lions weighed about 1,000 pounds. That's half a ton of feline carnivore. And Neanderthals hunted them with clubs and stabbing spears.
That I did not know.
Yeah. They figure it was for some sort of probably for some sort of symbolic reason, because if you're hungry, you don't go hunting a cave lion. But yeah, humans have been apex predators for a long, long time.
Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why Africa had the megafauna until recently. It's they co-evolved with us. If you trace the dispersion of modern humans, the further you get from Africa, the faster the large fauna disappears. And it's because they're, oh, what's that little thing with the stick? Ouch.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, though. The more we learn, the more we realize what we still don't know about the ancient past.
Oh, yeah.
Go back far enough where, I think they estimated once that like 75% of the species that have existed are lost to the records of time because they didn't leave fossils.
Yeah. And of course, 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct.
And part of that we know just because if you have this many apex predators, there has to be an even larger number of prey species, and not enough of them have survived in fossil form, so they know there's a glaring hole there somewhere.
Yeah. One of the interesting things they've done recently is stable bone isotope ratio analysis, which can tell you what an animal ate. And they've done it on human beings and non-human hominins. And it turns out that early humans back in the Paleolithic had the same ecological footprint as wolves. They got about half their calories from large grazing animals and most of the rest from smaller animals, birds, and fish. But Neanderthals had the same footprint as lions. They ate nothing but big grazing animals.
Yeah, they found proof that they were they hunted by like driving them into traps and stuff.
Yeah.
So they were clearly smarter than as kids you're taught. Oh, caveman, they're dumb. And then you see how they survived. And it's like, oh, maybe they weren't so dumb after all.
Yeah. Do you know what the last major physical change in humans was?
No.
It happened about 100 to 80,000 years ago. It was a sharp drop in male testosterone levels. They can tell because it has skeletal effects. And they figured that made it easier for humans to cooperate in large groups. And that's when we spread out of Africa and replaced all other hominids. There were earlier dispersions of humans directly ancestral to us, but they didn't work. But that one did. And it's probably because we've got better at large-scale cooperation.
They've also been finding evidence that suggests that Africa, I mean, it was the origin of some, but not the sole origin. There were simultaneous Homo sapiens sapiens species in other regions too that launched outward. So we're constantly finding there were more pockets than we thought existed of the early man. It's kind of interesting.
Complex.
Yeah. Have you heard of Curiosity Stream?
Yes.
They've got a lot of interesting documentaries on the topic, and now there are a few others like Curiosity Stream that are all sort of documentary research-based sort of programming. I just can't afford to subscribe to all of them because I would be poor. But there's a lot of good research coming out nowadays. It's fascinating.
So much research, so little time.
Absolutely. That's why I try to stay away from projects that require too much research, because I know myself, I will fall in a research hole. You will find me 10 years later and I will have had fun, but written nothing.
Yeah, I've got to control that myself. I've been doing a lot of Roman research for this series, for the book that's coming out. And it's fascinating stuff. And a lot of it's the accidents of survival.
Right.
Documentary evidence survives by low probability accidents from that far back, because every book had to be handwritten, and it had to be handwritten on things like papyrus and scraped boards and parchment. And a lot of it just didn't survive. Even a staple like Homer, there were only a few thousand copies at any one time in the Roman Empire. So that's one of the first things my time travelers introduce is paper and printing. Yeah, the Romans decide to call it libri terrunt, book stamping.
There's an interesting thing. Do you factor in like the language thing? Because that's the one thing everyone factors. Oh, I can just go to any era I want to and understand them. And I got fascinated by that. And that's why I realized you could probably not go much past the 1600s and speak modern English and understand them.
Oh, no.
So,
Shakespeare you could understand. Chaucer, no. Great vowel shift. That's why English spelling is so weird. It was actually quite phonetic when it was first regularized. But that was at the beginning of the Great Vowel Shift. And, like if you read Chaucer, you find that life and death rhyme because they were pronounced leaf and deeth back then. Yeah. But my time travelers are, this isn't much of a spoiler. They're historians, classical historians. So they all know Latin. At least they all know the written form of Latin. The actual pronunciation turns out to be a bit of a problem.
So, and one of my, as a grad student, one of my internships was I transcribed the 1770s Boston Gazette from type to actual Word document that could be uploaded to the website of the museum. So it was more searchable. And I realized that even just, that far back, some of the lettering looked different. So you had to think about it because the F's and the S's look the same. And so even though they had the same words, you still had to pay attention to understand it. Do you run into that with the Latin, with the way we write it now versus what it would have looked like back then?
Well, it's quite different. If you look at Roman inscriptions, they look perfectly comprehensible, and they are. They're basically our capital letters. There's a few differences. They didn't use W. V was usually their letter V was usually pronounced W, and a few things like that. But cursive, the actual handwriting they used in non-formal contexts. For one thing, they didn't separate words. They just ran everything together. And they didn't have nearly as much punctuation. And they didn't have upper and lower case. So reading Roman or Greek cursive is a bit of a strain. Although if you're a specialist in the period, you can do it because you're trained in it.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So one of my complaints, I dictate when I write my own novels, and I had to get an upgrade to Dragon. So while in the meantime, I was using the Word version, and that was my big complaint about it, is it didn't let you do like commands to paragraph break. So it would literally print all one just big text block. And that is a pain in the butt to read. So I can't imagine writing that way was easy because now you got to figure out where the words stop. And
it was much more oral. reading silently was considered the mark of a very great scholar in classical times. They didn't mostly. They muttered as they wrote, and when they read aloud. And it was much closer to an oral culture than ours is. As a matter of fact, reading silently became common about the same time. I think it was the 9th century, that putting gaps between words came in as a standard writing technique.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's one of the things is the shift of language. You learn if you've ever, like, when I was in school, we watched a production of Shakespeare Theater in the Round in the original Middle English, and when you read it in the modern translation, like, there are turns of phrase, it feels weird, and you just go with it. They talked weird back then, but when you listen to it in the original way it would have been pronounced, you realize it was a lot more lyrical than we thought, or than we think of it. Like, it flowed together. So some of the rhymes worked just because they sounded similar, and it doesn't translate when we pronounce it now.
Yeah.
So,
actually, if you look at the rhymes in Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales,
right,
more than 2/3 of them don't rhyme in modern English. With Shakespeare, it's about 80% do rhyme and about 20% don't, and that's because they're at the beginning and the end. They're only about 150 years apart, but there's more difference between Chaucer and Shakespeare than there is between Shakespeare and modern English.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because it was a period of very rapid transition. I read some of Henry VIII's letters once, and then some of Elizabeth I's, and she was his daughter, but there was a perceptible difference in the way they wrote their letters. So you could tell that the language was undergoing very rapid shifts at the time.
Yeah.
Of course, that was the London dialect of the language, which later on became standard. My father comes from Newfoundland, and there are areas in Newfoundland where until very recently you had to more or less learn the local dialect of English, the way you would a quasi-foreign language, or you couldn't understand a word of it. Lord Thunder and Jesus, yes.
So, last question of the religion questions, because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, we are no longer knuckle dragging troglodytes. So, coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
I used to drink caffeinated coffee, and a lot of it, and then I had to give it up, and I drink decaf now. Tea occasionally. I used to drink more tea, but that was when I was exposed to a lot of Brits in Kenya. And my mother was English. Well, she was actually born and raised in Peru, but her parents were English. My grandmother on that side was a VAD, a volunteer auxiliary detachment nurse in World War I. My grandfather was gassed at Passchendaele in 1917. They met in the convalescent hospital. Their families were opposed to the match, so they eloped. And as soon as the war was over, they sat down, got an atlas, and looked for the place furthest from England they could get. And that was Peru, so they moved there. You could tell there was a substantial amount of bitterness.
I could see that.
My father's mother was English too. Her ship, she was the youngest of 13 on a dairy farm in Wiltshire, and she was going to Boston in 1912 because they had relatives there and they could get her a job. And her ship hit an iceberg in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It wasn't the Titanic. And the passengers were all rescued and taken to St. John's, Newfoundland, and some of them were put up at a hotel there. And my grandfather was the son of the hotel owner, so.
And then the rest was history, as they say.
Yeah, but that shows you how contingent history is, how dependent it is, even your own existence, on really unlikely chances. If that ship hadn't hit a iceberg in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, I wouldn't exist. And if my mother's father hadn't been gassed at Passchendaele or had breathed in a little more deeply, I wouldn't exist. So, and think of the impoverishment of science fiction and fantasy.
And the humility. So one of the last questions in the getting to know you as a nerd. One of the last questions that we ask when we get to know the nerds that come on our show, because we all have the things we're passionate about if we're writing about them. As we ask the veterans these set of questions. So I know you said you served in the Canadian Army. So do you think?
No. The Canadian equivalent of the National Guard, the militia, it's called there.
Oh, I just generically call all of that Army. Here, the Guard, the Reserve, the active duty, it's still all Army, even though you would differentiate the branch. I didn't realize they were separate. But I know the Canadian military system is a lot more in common with the regimental system of the Brits than it is with what we have. So when you were in the Canadian militia, do you think your time in uniform there affects the way you tell stories?
Somewhat. I got a more realistic attitude towards military service than most people do. But then my father was a professional soldier, and I grew up on bases. So, and what I was saying about the contingency of history.
Right.
My father met my mother in St. John's, not St. John's, Halifax, Nova Scotia, in early 1942. And the reason he was at the party he met her at was that he'd been commissioned the year before and had been doing a exercise with a coastal defense gun because there were U-boats around and they were drilling on it. And he was in the bunker and he'd done a firing solution for the 7.2-inch gun, and he was about to order it to fire, live ammunition. And his sergeant said, "Sir, you need to do a visual check on the gun," because they couldn't see it from the bunker. And he said, "No, it's a good solution and that'll slow the exercise down." And the sergeant said, "Sir, you really need to take a visual check on the gun." So he went up the ladder, popped the hatch on the top of the bunker, and he transposed the function. And the gun was 180 degrees from where it should have been. And as a matter of fact, it was pointing directly at his CO, who was observing the exercise from a hill behind the position. So he spent the next 4 months on a small weather station on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And he just back, went to this party with a friend of his, and my mother had come with the friend. And he noticed that the friend was in a lineup for the men's room, and it was grossly overcrowded because it was 1942. And he went over to the table where she was sitting and said, "Sam wasn't feeling well and he had to leave, but he wanted me to walk you home." And and they were married a month later. So again, series of unlikely accidents.
Did he stay friends with the guy?
Yeah. He said that this experience taught him that you could trust your comrades with your life, but not with a bottle or a girl.
Absolutely. So do you ever draw from people that you served with when you were in the Canadian militia?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And people I met through my dad. And, well, my generation, most of our fathers were World War II vets in Canada. So, and I got a more realistic look than you would have reading the literature of the time, which was often sort of like euphemistic or skipped over some things. Like the father of a friend of mine had been commanded a squad of armored cars in Northwest Europe in 1944. And he was saying, "Well, we were conducting reconnaissance by fire." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that, sir?" And he said, "Well, the Germans were retreating, but there were these big stone farmhouses at wide intervals in the area we were going through. And sometimes they'd fortify one with a holdout to slow us down. And sometimes they wouldn't. And they wouldn't reveal themselves until you got within range. So we shot up all the farmhouses we saw. And if they were Germans in them, they'd shoot back because otherwise it would burn and fall down on their heads." And I said, "But what if it was just Belgian farmers?" And he said, "Oh, in that case, they died. Better them than us, son. Better them than us."
That is a very different approach on war than we could get away with in the age where everything is filmed as we're doing it.
Yeah, but it's better them than us, as the saying went.
Absolutely. So what did you do when you were in the Army?
Marched around a lot, went to Camp Petawawa for exercises, that sort of thing.
What was your job?
We got a bunch of what were then modern FN rifles. We were told again and again that we were going to get them. We were actually carrying Mark III Lee Enfields, and which was a good rifle in its day, but its day was back around the time of the First World War. So we just got into uniform, got into a truck, drove down to the armory in Ottawa, and waved a form at the people and walked out with several crates of FNs. One of our members was a kid from Quebec, and as we as we drove off, we started singing FLQ songs, Front de Libération Québécois.
So does your time in the militia affect the way you engage in content? I know some people that were in the military or first responders, when they watch like combat scenes, they'll count the bullets, or they didn't hold it right, or the tactics were wrong. Does that kind of
action? But I talked to a lot of people who did, and yeah, that introduced an element of realism, I think. And of course, my dad told me stories, and his friends told me stories.
That's the one problem sometimes you run into with history, is some of it is written with the assumption that you know certain things as just everybody knows them, so you don't have to write them down. And then as time passes, well, not everyone knows that, so stuff gets lost. So yeah. I imagine, with your experience, you were able to read between the lines better.
Mm-hmm. Or you can read the right sort of thing. Bill Maudlin, he did the Willie and Joe cartoons in World War II.
Yeah.
Well, he wrote a book called Five Brass Rings about his experiences. And he was in Italy, and they'd just taken a wounded German officer prisoner, and a soldier had stayed with the officer to help him. And Maudlin turned and said, I don't know anyone who'd do that for an American officer. and the reason that this was a risky thing to do was that you stood about if you surrendered individually or in small groups, you stood about a 50-50 chance of getting shot, simply because it was inconvenient to take prisoners. And that's one of the things that was sort of swept under the rug. But I noticed in Band of Brothers, the TV series based on the book,
right?
That actually happened once or twice, and it was something you couldn't have done in a 50s or 60s movie set during World War II, at least not showing us doing that. But it happened all the time.
Yeah, the other thing, and I've actually seen some historians now are talking about it, that they do in the military movies, is for some reason everyone is always older, where in reality, and Dunkirk actually went the other direction. They found nobody, unnamed author or actors who didn't have a big break yet, but were the right age group. Because realistically, like 18 to 25 is the range for most combat troops.
Well, yeah. My father-in-law was like 27 or 28 when he got drafted for World War II, and they called him the old man. You'd get a few older people, but yeah, most of the time it was people in their late teens, in their 20s. That's when you're at your physical peak. It's also when you're, shall we say, less cautious.
Your prefrontal cortex isn't finished developing.
Yeah. Charge that hill. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you think you're invincible, and that allows you to do great and mighty things.
Yeah. Or get killed.
Or get killed. Hopefully doing great and mighty things. So we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man, and then we're going to jump right back in, and we're going to talk about the books that brought us here.
Okay.
They picked a fight with the wrong species. A nation at war, the United Stars of America, born in the conflagration of an unprovoked alien attack, the newest entrant to galactic politics took the few crumbs of hypertech gifted to it and ran with them, soon expanding over dozens of star systems and establishing a wide trade network, protected by its powerful navy and the dreaded warp marines. In a fight to the death, a single marine platoon tasked with protecting an embassy on a hostile alien planet, an embassy and the fragile human enclave around it, that soon finds itself surrounded by armed mobs. Can the Marines and a ragtag band of civilian and Navy personnel survive long enough to be rescued?
So thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude. And now that we're back, we're going to start talking to SM Stirling about his new series. We're going to throw that cover up real quick so you can see what we're talking about. So you mentioned in the intro that when you were coming up with the idea for this, you were pitching ideas back and forth with Bill Fawcett. So what did he add to this series?
Well, he said that Roman times would be a good idea. Originally, I was going to do time travel to the Crimean War, but decided that wasn't. There are too many documentary sources for the 19th century. So Marcus Aurelius's time in Europe gave me a little more latitude. And besides which, I just have this Roman thing.
Yeah, I get that. What made you obviously the covers represent the spirit of a book and not necessarily a scene from the novel. What made you decide to send them back, at least visually, in modern clothes? Wouldn't it have been, if you're going to try to blend in, do the old Star Trek Prime Directive local clothing kind of thing?
Well, okay, this requires a little revealing of the first chapter. The person who invents the time machine is an Austrian physicist, and he's planning to bug out. They don't know precisely why. They think maybe he saw the future or whatever later on when they're thinking about it. But he gets them to Austria by saying that he's invented a process for securely calendar dating any artifact without destroying it. And this would be an archaeological holy grail and very important for historians too. And he says he wants my protagonist, who's just got his doctorate, but was formerly also a West Point graduate who was in the U.S. Rangers. And they get him, and the Austrian physicist gets him to recruit 4 graduate students who've specialized in different aspects of Roman history. And they all get there, and then the balloon goes up. It's World War III. This is set in 2032. And it's a very slightly alternate 2032. Whenever I'm writing in the near future, I use alternate history, because that way you don't get embarrassed by trying to predict the future and it turning out very differently than you anticipated. And they get sent back sort of post haste in an emergency fashion, and the Austrian physicist doesn't make it, or at least half of him makes it and the other half doesn't. But they get dropped back there. They were just told that it was a time machine and they didn't believe it. My protagonist says, "It's a time machine? Where's the upright circle of fake CGI Mercury and the big lever?" And, because would you believe it if someone said it was a time machine?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. But it turns out it actually is a time machine, and they get a very slow motion view of the results of a fusion bomb going off fairly close. And then they wake up in the 2nd century AD. 165 CE, 25th of June, and in Pannonia. And, well, they know the period at least as well as we do know it. But there are certain things that, they don't know precisely, like the Marcomannic Wars are about to start, which Marcus Aurelius spent the last 15 years of his life fighting. And it might have started in 165 or 166 or 167. And from 1800 years in the future, that doesn't look like a big difference. But if you're on the ground waiting for Marcomannic and Quadi types with a spear in one hand and a torch in the other showing up with arson and murder on their minds, it's important to get the precise date. Things like that. And since the world destroyed itself just as they were leaving, they decide to see if they can alter the time, alter history, and that creates all sorts of difficulties. And I thought I think I did it reasonably well, and I had a lot of fun doing it too. Yes, they introduce some technological innovations. There's an afterword at the end of the book. It's titled "Afterword for Nerds Like Me." And it's about various time travel stories. There's a convention in science fiction, or at least was until recently, that people in science fiction books didn't read or watch science fiction, which I find rather odd considering how dominant it is in our popular culture these days. So my protagonists all do read science fiction, or at least occasionally, and watch science fiction movies. And introducing innovations is difficult or easy depending on whether they're type A or type B, as the protagonists say. Type A is where the idea is the important thing, and they can do it with the materials, tools, and skills available. Type B is something where you'd need to make the tools to make the tools to make the tools to make the thing. He uses steam engines as an example. James Watt got the idea for his steam engine while he was an instrument maker at the University of Glasgow. And it took him nearly a decade and a lot of money put up by a guy called Bolton to get the requisite degree of precision in boring the cylinders and the valving and that sort of thing. And that was in what was at the time the most advanced manufacturing technology in the world. It would have been impossible in Roman times without, as I said, a long series of inventing things to invent things to invent things to make the thing. The Romans didn't have cast iron, for example. They certainly didn't have metalworking lathes. They could do amazing things, but they did them in different ways. On the other hand, if you're going to introduce, say, a cradle scythe or a wooden frame saddle with stirrups, those they could make. They had all the technology and skills necessary to make them. They just hadn't had the idea. And there's an amazing amount of stuff that you can introduce type A like that. And of course, a lot of ideational technology too, like positional arithmetic, double entry bookkeeping, germ theory of disease and disinfection. They get Aelius Galenos, the great Greek doctor of the time, on their side, and they introduced the medical stuff through him. He was good at academic bun fighting. That's not a modern invention. And they eventually meet the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, and my protagonist impresses the emperor by quoting from his book that he hasn't written yet, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. At one point, he quotes from it, and the emperor says, "You echo my own thoughts on the matter, Tribune, but I have not yet reduced them to so eloquent and compact a form." Is it stealing someone's credit to quote from a book that they were going to write but haven't?
It's an interesting concept. They played with that on a movie where for whatever reason the Beatles hadn't written anything, so this guy wakes up in that alternate reality and he starts releasing their music and gets really famous, like in modern times.
Yeah.
So the concept has been around and it's fun to play with. I think just time travel in general. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, everyone thinks, well, I know how to drive a car, so if I go back in time, I'll just make a car. But just because you can drive it doesn't mean you understand the mechanics behind the combustion engine and all the various like scientific aspects of it. And that's something people forget.
Yeah, and of course, devil's in the details. You'd have to have various types of alloy steel. You'd have to have ball bearings. You'd have to have precision machining for the cylinders and the piston rings, the valving, and you'd have to get gasoline and somehow refine petroleum. The things like that require an enormous backlog of skills and machinery and technique. As I said, other things are quite simple. And they can have big effects, even though they are simple. I mean, stirrups did. And in Roman times, they harvested grain with sickles, the curved thing.
Right.
And the maximum amount of grain you can harvest in a day with a sickle is 1/4 to 1/3 of an acre, depending how dense the stand is. And this was the basic constraint on Roman agriculture. And of course, agriculture was what most people did. They had scythes, but you can't use an ordinary scythe to harvest grain because it scatters it and you've got to rake it up and that makes the kernels fall out. But there's an American invention of the 18th century. It's called a cradle scythe. It has a series of wooden fingers over the blade in a framework. And if you use that, you can cut the grain, it falls onto the wooden fingers, and you can tip it off into a nice, neat row. And with that, you can harvest 8 to 10 acres a day. And that's a increase in productivity of, let's see, 4 times 8. That's a big increase in productivity. And it's a very simple invention. Anybody, any carpenter and smith could have made it back in Roman times. They just didn't have the idea. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that.
Yeah, some of the archery technology, it wouldn't take very much if you know how to make the later versions to leapfrog that technology. Some of the concepts of smelting for arrows you could do if you knew the combination and access the raw material based on region.
The Romans had charcoal and sulfur and saltpeter. They used saltpeter and sulfur as medications and bleaching agents and stuff. But they didn't know what happens if you put them together in a 75, 15, 10 mixture and grind it up. So
you can make primitive firearms way before the Chinese did it.
Well, at least primitive gunpowder.
Right.
And you could have a catapult throw a ball full of gunpowder with a fuse. All you need for a fuse is a piece of cord. You soak it in saltpeter, and it'll burn. Things like that. A lot of it is, as I said, very basic. Of course, the protagonist did the West Point course, and there's a lot of history of military technology.
Absolutely.
There.
And that can be a game changer. The exploding, catapult throwing cannonballs, especially when you think about in the wooden ship era where the triremes and whatnot would have densely packed rowers in there. You don't even have to necessarily burn the ship down to incapacitate it if you're, shrapneling the crew.
Well, at one point, my protagonist is talking to some Roman naval types, and he says, and this is a malogranatum. And he shows them something that looks like a bronze copy of a pomegranate. And a pomegranate was called a malogranatum. And it's a grenade. He shows you how to light it and chuck it. He lights it with what he calls a ronsonius. And he says, and when you throw it, it is very mallow indeed. And they all get a big laugh out of that because mallow meant evil or bad in Latin. And it's a grenade. You just drop it over the side into the galley next to you, and bad things happen.
So do you speak Latin then to get some of this, or did you spend an exorbitant amount of time in the research?
Well, I took Latin. I was at English-style boarding schools in the 60s in Kenya, and Latin was compulsory. As a matter of fact, one of them was run by an ex-colonel, a 94-year-old ex-colonel in the British Army of India, who told some really interesting stories, and his ex-regimental sergeant major.
Interesting.
Yeah. We did cross-country running with a guy following along behind us with a 4-foot split bamboo cane. And if you stopped,
that would motivate you.
If he stopped, he hit you. He hit you with it. But I know some Latin, and there are good translation programs available now.
Well, no, they're setting up the puns of the the evil, play with the grenade. Yeah. I wouldn't even have thought to look for that because I don't, speak the language. So,
actually, Latin was a good language for puns, and if you've read some of the satirists and humorists of the time, they did a lot of wordplay. It's actually quite funny if you can understand it.
The other thing that we realize is a soldier doesn't change that much, because if you look at some of the excavated barracks in both Pompeii and what we found at Hadrian's Wall, they're still drawing penises and boobs everywhere. I'm like, the more we change, the more nothing changes.
There's a cave in Scotland where some Vikings waited out some bad weather, and they wrote runic graffiti on the walls. And there was like, Yngvi was here. So and so fucked, I wrote this. Ingrid is the most beautiful woman in the world, and then he drew a sketch of a drooling dog next to the statement. Some things don't change. Oh, and a bit of graffiti from a Roman military base. Lucius, privileged soldier of the 10th Legion, was here. All the women will tell you he's a stallion. And Roman soldiers carried their gear on a pole with a cross on it over their
Marius's mules.
Yeah, Marius's mules. And the thing they carried the gear on was called a furca. And that was just the name of it, but it's also the name of an instrument of judicial torture, um, which shows you that soldiers' humor doesn't change all that much.
No, not at all. So right now, this looks like it's a standalone. Is this going to be a series? I'm going to throw the cover up.
Yeah.
Just to
I'm halfway through the second book right now. To turn the tide, and the next one will be called The Winds of Fate. It's going to be at least 3 books and possibly another 3 after that. And then who knows?
Hopefully people will buy it so that you keep writing it, because I'm already interested. And in fact, I think that would be an interesting panel. I can see if I can get some more authors that have done this. It'd be interesting to see who has used Roman culture and the military organization and all that in fiction as a panel topic.
Mm-hmm.
That could be fun.
The Romans were interesting people, in some ways similar to us, in other ways radically different. So it makes for some interesting contrasts.
It does. I've listened to the time travel book Michael Williamson has written. I don't know if you've read his, and that's one of the things he got right, is everyone tries to write the Romans just like us, just, more military organized. And they forget, like, most of the people that write the Romans, they don't write them brutal enough. It's like, yeah, just kick it up a few levels, because survival was difficult back then, and you won by being stronger than everyone else, which meant you had to be tougher than them.
Yeah. And read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Marcus Aurelius was an empathetic softy by Roman standards. By ours, he was a serious hard ass.
Yeah, and I own a copy of that. I read it every year or so. It's he started the idea of Stoicism as we know it today. Mm-hmm. Although they imply he stole a lot of his ideas from the Greeks, but they say that about anything Roman, so I don't know how much of that is just Greek propaganda.
Well, he wrote it in Greek.
What's that?
I said Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations in Greek.
Now that I didn't know. I've got an English translation, because that's all. Obviously, I don't speak ancient or Roman or Greek. So, do you have them when they're going back in time? Obviously, we know what written Roman is because the records exist. Romans were fastidious record keepers, but we're guessing at some level on the pronunciations. Does that?
Yeah, there have been reconstructions based on philological methods that you can use to construct ancient languages. For example, Caesar wasn't pronounced Caesar in classical Latin. It was pronounced more like Caesar.
Caesar, okay.
The Germans borrowed that word early, and the pronunciation didn't change in German the way it did in Romance languages, where K was elided to sort of a S sound. So Cicero wasn't pronounced Cicero, it was pronounced Cicero.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Veni Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, which was actually Veni Vidi Vici. But they discover that the reconstructions aren't entirely accurate. And for the first couple of weeks, they have terrible problems speaking comprehensible Latin or understanding what people around them are saying. But then they catch on. They do know the language, although they know bookish Latin. And there was quite a gap between what ordinary people spoke and what aristos and rhetoricians wrote. So they sound like they're talking like someone writing a book with a serious pickle up their butt.
But that's true of academics even today. If you read like some of the academic prose versus how the average person on the street talks, it's true. No matter, you almost have to prove you're smarter than everyone else by using big words and writing in a certain sort of officious way. So I get that. Do you plan on, obviously you want the series to go ongoing, so there's a lot up in the air based on what happens in future books. So have you planned out the future books, or do you write it as you sort of plan it as you go?
I know, generally speaking, what's going to happen. The details come to me as I write. Kipling once said there are 99 ways of construing tribal lays, and every single one of them is right. I did a couple of collaborations with Dave Drake. Great guy. Sorry that what happened to him. But Dave wrote very detailed outlines. He wrote 40,000 word outlines for a 120,000 word book, specifying exactly what happened in every scene. And he did this for himself as well as, when he was collaborating. And actually, I found it oddly liberating. I could concentrate on the detail and the description and so forth, and didn't have to worry about the plot. Plot more or less comes to me. I did a collaboration with Anne McCaffrey, and she sent me a 2-page outline for a 120,000 word book. So people just do things in different ways. George often cuts hundreds of pages from his first draft. And matter of fact, once he cut enough to make a 630-page book out of the stuff he cut from one book. And I couldn't do that, but he does it, and it works quite well.
So do you plan on having them come home?
No.
At any point in time, they're going to stay there?
No, they're stuck there, and they don't know anything about the time machine. They're historians, not scientists. So they don't know what its limitations were. They don't know how it worked. They're just stuck there. And besides which, the place that they came from was blown up and everyone in it was killed less than 2 seconds after they left. So
was the implication that the whole world was dying because of the war, or just there where they happened to be wrong place, right time?
Wrong place, right time, but it's a global thermonuclear war with thousands of fusion bombs. And as one of them says, well, they bombed Vienna, which was a neutral, the capital of a neutral European country of no particular strategic significance. And another one says, well, if they bombed Vienna, where wouldn't they bomb? La Paz, Bolivia, maybe?
Yeah, that's an and then you end up, when you talk about time travel, with the concept of, if you go back in time, just the stepping foot in the grass on when you cross over, you've changed the timeline. So are you in the same timeline, or have you created parallel realities or parallel timelines? And it gets really complicated and brain breaking really fast if you think about it too hard.
They speculate about that. They don't know whether they're changing their own past or whether they're starting a new timeline. And there's absolutely no way they can test it. So until
they do something that changes enough that they're not born and they disappear.
Yeah, but then that's a sort of circular argument.
Absolutely.
I've actually, my own feeling on the matter is that if time travel is possible, then time is mutable, and you either have a multi-branching set of alternate realities, or you can change the one that produced you. I've read science fiction stories where people try to change history after time travel and they can't. Something prevents them. But the problem with that is that you'd have to have some sort of intelligent entity checking on you and then making things happen so that you couldn't modify time. And I just don't find that very credible. But then again, it's a non-falsifiable hypothesis until we actually get time travel, which physicists have told me is mathematically very similar to traveling faster than light.
Interesting. I don't know that I've ever looked into it. My favorite take on time travel, have you seen the movie Timeline?
Yes.
Where they go back in time, and the movie's 20 years old, people. The big plot twist is going back in time is what made the timeline they were in the first place.
Yeah, because causation. Timeline did that a lot too.
I like that idea, as maybe you going back there is what made the timeline what we know it as today. Mm-hmm. There's so much room to play. One of the things I like about modern time travel stuff is they're not as hidebound. This is the only way to do it. So you see a lot more, ideas, do they hold up? That's for you to decide, but there's certainly variety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Time, the more I study history, the more I realize that a lot of things are the result of low probability accidents.
Yes.
World War I started when it did because Gavrilo Princip shot Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne. But what actually happened was that I don't think the Serbian military intelligence guy who sent these people to Sarajevo expected them to succeed. One of them just deserted on the way there, decided he didn't want to take the risk. So they throw a bomb at Franz Ferdinand's motorcade, and it misses and injures some people in the car behind him. And then Gavrilo Princip mooches off to have lunch, thinking that the whole thing has failed. And Franz Ferdinand decides to go and visit the people who were injured in the hospital. But his driver takes a wrong turn, not being familiar with Sarajevo, runs up against the river, because he thought he was turning onto the bridge and it wasn't the street that led to the bridge. So he backed up and then stalled the car, and he stalled it right in front of the place where Gavrilo Princip had gone to have lunch. So Princip had just walked out, and there were his targets right in front of them, so he shoots them. Think of the cascade of low probability accidents that had to occur for that to happen. And then it turned out that Franz Ferdinand was unalterably opposed to anything that threatened war between Austria, Hungary, and Russia because he thought it would destroy the dynasty, which he was right in. So removing him royally pissed off the Austrian government, and it also removed the most cautious person who had significant influence on Austrian foreign policy. And Franz Ferdinand was unpopular. No one liked him except his wife, Sophie, except Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm was an actual genuine friend of his. And Wilhelm was royally pissed off when he was killed. So Wilhelm had a pattern of provoking international crises, then chickening out at the last minute. This time, he didn't chicken out nearly as soon. And the German General Staff, which wanted a war, talked him into going on to his usual holiday in Norway and sent someone along to make sure he didn't send any qualifying messages. By the time he got back, it was too late for him to stop what was going on. So killing Franz Ferdinand actually did start World War I because it removed a block and it enraged one of the main participants.
There's a couple of places where the war could have turned out differently too, because based on his writings, Wilhelm knew there were problems with his general staff, and there were a couple of times where he almost countermanded some orders that would have, stopped some of the worst losses the Germans suffered, and they would have been at a different place at the negotiating table, and it might have ended differently. And had he followed his gut, World War II might not have ever happened.
Yeah, well, but Hitler was an ordinary foot soldier in World War I. He was a company and then a battalion messenger. And that was the most dangerous job. It was more dangerous than being an ordinary grunt because you had to get up and run around delivering messages. And you had to get out of the trench a lot of the time. At one time, Hitler and 3 other messengers were waiting outside battalion headquarters. Hitler got a message and dashed off to deliver it. Less than a minute later, a shell landed at the entrance to the bunker and killed the other 3 messengers. So, and that happened over and over and over again. At the end of the war, Hitler had been poisoned and temporarily blinded by mustard gas, and he was in hospital. So he got the Iron Cross First Class, which was extremely rare for an enlisted man to get in those days, because he was apparently just nerveless and took chances all the time. So his surviving 4 years on the Western Front was a statistically anomalous accident. And if he'd been killed, who knows what had happened.
And you think some of that is big picture, that's a rarity. Having been in war zones, I can say that is more common than you would think. I remember just one instance that always sticks in my head is we're out of the transient barracks or transient staging area for convoys in Baghdad. And we were probably 75 meters from the porta potty. I get there and I realize I forgot my toilet paper. So I turn around and about halfway back to my vehicle to get the toilet paper, a mortar lands in the porta potty. So you think about all the things that would have follow on knock-on events, the butterfly effect, essentially that would have changed based on that one, circumstance. And it's the only time I'd ever forgotten my toilet paper, because when you live on MREs, toilet paper is very, very important.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's if I had one combat soldier tell me, and I had a dozen, it was that it was important to be good at what you were doing, but it was even more important to be lucky.
Yes. And the fact that you do it as a young man, it makes you a little bit more fearless. I remember some of the times we were sleeping on cots outside of our trucks because if you're transporting sensitive equipment, you have to stay on it. So there's permanent guard, and the base was getting shelled. And one of the new guys was panicking. I remember we woke up and we're like, oh, they're 75 meters. Wake me up when they get closer. And you think about it looking back, because, you just kind of get desensitized. And I'm like, they only had to get lucky once, and it was game over because we didn't fill the bunkers like we were supposed to.
Yeah,
so
there's a degree of necessary fatalism.
Yeah, and that's one of the things the Romans were very good at. If you read some of the reports from their I don't want to say common soldiers, but some of the more senior NCOs that left records, because the Romans were more literate than some other armies, I think, in the world at the time. They had a lot of that going on. I think other than the amount of some of the brutality, they have more in common with the average modern soldier than any other era of military, I would think.
Yeah, well, they had an elaborate bureaucracy. They kept the file on every soldier. It's an odd combination of the archaic and the modern.
Absolutely.
Also, a lot depends on the individual. The father of a friend of mine was in Korea, and he got a decoration because he volunteered for every trench raid in the static phase of the war. And he was asked why he volunteered. And I went and read the original records in the archives, not the condensed version that was given with the citation for the medal. And he was asked why he volunteered for all these raids. And he said, I was bored. I don't like being bored. And the one where he got the decoration, his platoon made a demonstration against the Chinese lines. He rolled into a Chinese trench and went down it and killed somewhere between 15 and 20 Chinese soldiers, all of them awake and trying to kill him with a sharpened entrenching tool. And he just went down the trench and killed a man every second step. And there are people like that.
Sergeant York, if you read his stories about, although it's more interesting with him because he was almost a pacifist. They had to talk him into deploying.
Yeah.
So if you can flank the trenches, you limit the amount of force they can bring to bear. So that sounds like one man, all that many people. Yeah, right. But when you factor in the narrow hallway effect that the trench gives you, it's a lot more believable.
Yeah, and it was dark.
Yeah.
On the ship coming back from Korea, one of the ratings on one of the NCOs on the ship started chivying him about his uniform, which was sort of sloppy, and he just picked the guy up and threw him overboard. And he happened to fall past an open porthole where someone was looking out, and they stopped the ship and rescued him and all that. It was hushed up because this guy was up for a medal and they didn't want to disrupt the narrative. But if he hadn't fallen past an open window with someone looking out, it would have been a mystery of the sea.
It's funny how that works. Now, do you factor in with this, they're in the Roman eras, do you play with the naval side or do you keep them mostly land-based?
There's some stuff with the Classis Pannonica, the Pannonian fleet, which was a river fleet on the Danube. And there's a naval fight about halfway through. And it's fairly interesting, if I say so myself, a naval fight at night.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the channel Tasting History?
Yeah.
They actually do some breakdowns. I'll link to it, dear listener, if you haven't checked them out. Tasting History. They do a lot of videos. The guy was an Imagineer for Disney, and he got bored. So he said, I like to cook. I wonder if I can make what these people are doing or were eating back then. So he started doing crazy research, and he recreates to the best of our ability with modern ingredients some of these classics. And he recreated garum, which is the sauce they put on everything like we put on ketchup. And I've tried it's gross. I don't know how they ate it. I mean, I guess if that's all you had for flavor, maybe.
Tasted kimchi.
Yeah, it's gross.
Yeah, exactly. People, it's what you're raised with. Garum was made from fermented, which is to say selectively decayed fish guts. It was a byproduct of the salt fish industry. And it's grotesque. But they loved it.
I do haggis too, and I guess if you're starving. So the other cool thing is there's a couple, like, as reenacting has gotten more popular, and there's a huge community of Roman reenactors or living historians, depending on the unit. Some of them, it's more murky. The living historians tend to be this unit at this era, so they're period correct to a very narrow window, because obviously everyone thinks a certain look when they think Roman Legion, but that wasn't all of the Roman history. Like, that was a very narrow window where they wore that specific uniform.
Things changed.
Right. And depending on the size of the army at the time, the wealth of the nation at the time, where the coins were on their devaluation, because there were times where they kind of cut the silver weight. But there are some units that will go and they'll do lectures entirely in Latin, and they'll talk about their service to an audience to kind of get that full immersion for them. And you can watch some of that. Some of those are recorded, and it's kind of fascinating to watch. You have to have the patience to read the subtitles if you want to know what he's saying.
Yeah, the Ermine Street Guard and those guys.
Yeah, that's actually what I was thinking about. Did you use any of that for research to try to get
Yeah, lots of it. The thing about historical recreation like that is that it can eliminate things that sound reasonable on paper, but turn out to be actually physically impossible. Yeah, and a lot of that stuff has shown how Roman equipment actually functioned.
Yeah,
that sort of thing, which is it's just damned useful, particularly if you're careful about it.
The other thing is all of these people that were ancient warriors, we think, well, we saw this in a picture, this is how they did it. But this old expression, never underestimate an old man in a young man's game kind of thing. I'm butchering the paraphrase, but the idea, if you live long enough to be the old guy, maybe you should assume they know a thing or two. And so when you look at history, if you can take the weapon, and it helps to have it in your hand, there are creative things you could still do that might not be in the manual that you could write into a fiction book. And I've seen some of that done where they wouldn't have used the weapon that way. But if it works, why wouldn't
Hollywood is terrible at battles. Absolutely awful. It always dissolves into this melee with people fighting individually. And at least as far as the Roman army was concerned, that was not the way they did it. They acted in unison. And that was what they usually won.
That was what allowed the Roman legion structure, and that's why it's used in a lot of sci-fi. Because if you're disconnected and you don't have like teleportation, you're disconnected from your resupply, you have to have larger unit numbers, because when people die, you don't get a replacement right away. And that was one thing about the Roman legion structure. One, it was designed to bleed, so they expected losses. And because they were in such a tight packed formation, but they were extremely maneuverable because of the sub-unit structure, that's how they were able to outflank and outmaneuver the phalanx, which up until that time was considered basically a walking tank formation.
Yeah.
Is because of that.
They combined the virtues of mass and flexibility at the same time.
Absolutely.
The Romans were very inventive about military stuff. And they also, if they saw something that worked and someone else was using it, they'd take it immediately.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and run with it and improve it. They weren't technically all that inventive. I mean, they did invent some interesting stuff like concrete that would set underwater and so forth. But they were great at synthesizing and well, just appropriating anything that worked. And that helps with the plot of my book, because immediately they see something that will make them money or give them a military advantage or anything of that nature, they'll just take it and run with it. They got no hesitation about that at all. They were jackdaws that way.
Absolutely.
Oh, and Roman merchants often put a slogan in mosaic at the door of their houses. Their favorite was "Salve lucrum," which means "Hello, profit."
Capitalism. I love it.
Yeah.
Do you have, so obviously if you're going to do time travel, and we don't want spoilers because I'm going to read the book. Do you know if they're going to be doing audiobook?
I think no. The previous publisher I was with did them all the time. I don't know whether Bain does or not.
They do some and not others, and I haven't figured out a pattern on what they will and will not do. And I'm sure they have one. I'm not like trying to besmirch them or anything. I just don't know how they determine.
Yeah, neither do I.
I imagine some of it's by what genres sell better in audio. Mm-hmm. Because for all they get a reputation, Bain's, if you look at some of their audience, because they're a lot of people will pigeonhole them as just this right-wing company. I'm like, they published Out and Out Communists. What are you talking about?
Well,
right. I thought he was a communist, but either way, he's a nice guy. I met him. But,
same thing.
Yeah, but I mean, like they'll publish anything if the story's good. I don't get that smirk, but I do know, they tend to.
They published Lois McMaster Bujold for a long time.
I don't know anything. I know the name and I know some of the titles, but I don't think I've met or talked to them or read them. But I don't know.
Oh, actually, she's very good.
Okay. I know Terry Mixon raves about her books. I just haven't had a chance. There's so much of the classics that I'd liked, and then not the, I guess, near classics that I missed when I was going through school and I didn't have time to read. That I'm
a little time.
Yeah, I will die with a TBR list, I am sure.
Die with a book on your teeth.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's what saved my life when I was getting back from Iraq the second time, and I was like, this sucks. Survivor's guilt's a bitch, and I didn't want to be in this earth anymore. And I started reading a book that was in the 2007 era, like serialization of novels was a thing, so they were released a lot more often in the indie side, but it would be like maybe 30,000 words, and you just and I'm like, well, I want to know what happens before I go, and that's what kept me going long enough for the therapy to work. So I will probably die with the book in my hands, and I'll be happy for it. But do you have any plans about like what kind of historic events you want them to experience while they're over there?
Well, back there. Back there. Well, the Marcomannic Wars. In our history, they lasted 15 years. They have the protagonist, Arthur, they call him Artorius. Well, actually, it's spelled Artorius, but it's pronounced Artorio. He has plans for that, but I can't reveal much of the plans without spoiling the...
we don't want spoilers. So the other thing to think about with time travel is what you take with you. Obviously, because of how they went over, they're wearing normal clothes. Was that something, whether the execution was able to give it to them or not, that they originally, when they were thinking about it, they planned for?
Well, the physicist who invented the time machine used a lot of his R&D money in what one of the protagonists calls an oh naughty so bad way, and bought a lot of stuff, about 1 metric ton, including some money, synthetic gemstones, which the Romans couldn't tell from the real thing, working models of various pieces of machinery, books, 4 ruggedized military-grade laptops with external drives and a solar charging unit, stuff like that. And it all comes in very useful. Oh, and 2 big crates of antibiotics and antivirals. You're not going to have any experience with the bacilli of 165.
Absolutely.
And, if you've ever had the runs, yeah.
MREs, yep, I understand.
Going into the watershed used to be hideously dangerous because there'd be a whole new set of parasites and bacteria in the water.
And then getting used to some of the way they cooked things, some of the exposures, and they didn't always know about cooking, like talk about pork or preserving fish, and so there was a risk when you ate too.
Oh yeah.
Do they bring? So we've talked about some of the hardware and the knowledge there. Do they change anything because we have knowledge of spices that they might not have heard of yet, but they would know where they are potentially?
Well, actually, there's some seeds they take back with them: corn, potatoes, and peppers. And it turns out the Romans just absolutely love Texas barbecue sauce. My protagonist is from West Texas, near Amarillo. And they love barbecue sauce, Texan barbecue sauce. Weeping as they munch, but they love it.
I dig it.
Jalapenos and stuff.
The other thing is people don't realize is when you see people railing about genetically modified food, is they don't realize we've been doing that since before the pharmaceutical company exists. Like modern corn is, if you look at what corn was originally, it was the smaller little ones you see in like Chinese dishes, right? They're really tiny ones. Yeah. And what we know of corn was modified. So when they take stuff back, do they take modern versions or did they like gradiate it?
No, what they take back is modern versions aimed at the organic sustainable market, true breeding varieties. And one of them is one of the protagonists. His dad ran a seed and feed company in Wisconsin, and his academic specialty, is Roman agriculture. And he uses his phone, translates the labels, which are in Magyar, on the seeds, and says, "Yeah, organic sustainable market, aimed at the organic sustainable market. And then he says, if you get me some land and some guys to help, I could get most of this stuff planted.
Nice.
And yeah, and it turns out, and the Columbian exchange, the exchange of food crops, made a really big difference over more than half the world in agriculture, because things like potatoes and corn changed the whole dynamics of agriculture.
The hard part going back that far would be giving up coffee, because I don't think they would have had that yet.
No, actually, at one point, one of them is grousing. This is a lousy day to have to ride 30 miles in. I'd like to stay home with a cappuccino, maybe some cocoa with rum. And one of the others says, "Oh, please don't do that. I'd be so sad after I finish slashing you to death for reminding me." And another one says, "Remember caffeine withdrawal?"
That's good. That's the hard part. Like I couldn't imagine the withdrawal from that. So what is the span? Obviously, you've got the first chapter, you have them, kind of cross over. What is the span of time that the individual novels cover?
Well, the first one covers just under 3 years.
Okay.
The second one picks up immediately after. And so far, I've covered 3 years in it, and I'm halfway through.
Do you have a plan on the total span? I'm assuming Arthur's life would be the span.
Well, maybe, his, and so there are some other viewpoint characters among the 4 graduate students he takes back with them. So, yeah. And then there are also chapters written from the viewpoint of some of the locals. Okay. They get discovered. No, I don't want to spoil things. Yeah. Do you know how many authors it takes to change a light bulb?
Well, one, but the light bulb has to want to change itself.
No, forget about that. Let me tell you about my light bulb.
So I imagine one of the hard parts about this as an audiobook is you're going to have to get someone who can actually pronounce the Latin. As you're doing that would be difficult for you.
I specify how things sound, but yeah, it would have to be someone who was willing to do a little research. I've had problems with people not understanding how languages are pronounced in other audiobooks of other books I've written, because I have a tendency to quote different languages.
So are there any parts of the globe where you would like to see these characters travel? Because obviously you're starting in a very sort of narrow corridor for this war. Presumably when the war ends, the story continues. Obviously you don't have to tell us what you're going to do, but if you could pick cool places to take them.
Some of them go to Rome. And in the second book, some of them end up on the Roman-Parthian border in the Middle East. Actually, the protagonist looks around and thinks, this place smells just as bad as when I was here in the 21st. Yeah,
I'm just thinking, I've had a lifelong obsession with like Hadrian's Wall and the Celtic Wars. Mm-hmm. I just think it's fascinating, like the clash of cultures. So I can, and then the Gaulish Wars with the Germans. So there's so many fascinating areas to cover. I think you missed Vercingetorix though for the timeline you took them back when.
Oh yeah, that was 200 years before this.
But that would have been a cool one to have them. You start thinking about all the cool people you can meet, and unfortunately, there's such a window of space between all of them that it's like, how do I get them all together? Mm-hmm. I mean, shy of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, I don't know that you can.
Yeah, well. He meets Prince Balamar, who was the Marcomannic leader who started the Marcomannic Wars. And oddly enough, Balamar isn't a German name, although the Marcomanni were German speakers mostly. It's a Gallic name because there were Gauls living in the place the Marcomannic War started, and the Marcomanni conquered the area about 100 years before, but the influence went both ways. And Balamar means mighty arm in Celtic. Little later on, the protagonist wonders, I wonder what chopped off head means in Celtic. But yeah.
So some authors, when they write, speculative fiction, shy away from anything religious related because they don't want to offend. But obviously, if you're going into prehistory or Roman era history, I mean, their religion was very important to them. So is that something you factor into your novel, or do you sort of skirt it?
one of the things that surprises them is how much time a Roman emperor has to devote to taking auguries and making sacrifices to the gods and that sort of thing. And one of the four graduate students is Jewish, and they meet a Jewish merchant almost immediately when they get back there, and things happen. And they speculate on what effect their presence and what they're introducing is going to have on the religious development of the next couple of centuries. And and there's a wedding ceremony, and I had fun researching the wedding ceremony. Roman weddings were strange, but they contained some elements that were very similar to ours. I mean, engagement rings. The Romans had engagement rings, and they even wore them on the same finger.
Oh, that I did not know.
And Roman grooms carried the bride over the threshold.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was to prevent a stumble, which would be very unlucky. And part of the ceremony was signing the marriage contract. 10 people had to sign it, and then it was sealed.
They definitely had an understanding of the concept of PTSD, even though they didn't have a name for it. There are some primary sources. I remember talking about it as an undergrad. I focused more heavily on ancient history just because it was fascinating. Unfortunately, if you want to do anything ancient or medieval, you have to learn to speak another language. So I stuck with American history so I could stick with English. But one of the things I remember was they had this, I guess it was a newspaper article, and the guy lost in court because he didn't tell the guy he sold the slave to that he had been attacked by a bear, and so he had trauma. And that is something they were legally required to disclose, the trauma, because it affected them emotionally. So at some level they understood, but what qualified as trauma was really vague because war happened all the time. So, I mean, if you're no crap, he saw war. But in this case, it was a bear attack that he didn't disclose. So they understood some about the psyche that we assume that is relatively modern, I think, as well.
Yeah, they conceptualize it differently, but a lot of the phenomenon were the same. I read a book of ancient Roman jokes, and one of them was someone comes to this guy and he complains, "That slave you sold me, he just died." And the guy looks at him and says, "Well, that's odd. He never did that when I owned him."
They also had surgery that was more advanced than we give them credit for too, which if you're doing combat stuff, you're gonna tap into at some point, because there is evidence of brain surgery.
The big drawback of surgery and why they didn't do it unless it was really essential was that they didn't know about infection.
Right.
But actually introducing antiseptics is relatively easy. You just introduce distillation and then you run the distilled stuff through the still 3 or 4 times, and it makes an excellent disinfectant. Hurts like hell though. But
yeah. Do you? I mean, obviously, in the military, and this guy was a West Point guy, Ranger, so I'm assuming he likes a good booze too. That's actually not as hard to transport because it's relatively simple to make alcohol.
Yeah.
Is that something they do while they're there? You play with the food and drink?
Yeah, he makes a still. One of the first things he does is make a still.
That tracks. I was going to say that'd be one of the first things I do.
Yeah, and he notices that there's a lot of fruit going to waste. So he introduces wheelbarrows to carry the fruit and a still to make white lightning out of it. Yeah. It's very popular. And then he introduces, they call it super wine. And then he introduces double distilled super wine as a disinfectant.
And actually, then, of course,
one of Marcus Aurelius' sons died after an operation. He had a tumor behind one of his ears, and the operation was successful, and then it got the tumor out and didn't kill him, but he died of an infection from that. So
you can prevent that in this scenario because you've got him there. Well, assuming that they traveled to before when the surgery was, because obviously I don't know.
They did. I checked.
You also, if you're introducing potatoes, you can get tequila because that's relatively simple to create.
Yeah,
and corn. Yeah, that could get interesting. Do you what kind of research do you have to do for the plausibility of some of the stuff that they're doing? Is that something you just already knew, or did you have to find experts on your own?
I had a general knowledge of it, but I did research on what grows where. And
Yeah.
yep, corn and potatoes grow perfectly well in Pannonia, which is now Austria, basically.
Yeah. And that, so that if you're in that era, they would still have some of the grand villas and stuff as far as housing. The Roman housing style would be what we would associate with it, because later on it became more just medieval, I guess, what we would associate with that. But you're in the era where it was classically Roman in the aesthetic.
Yeah, there are some visits to villas and that sort of thing, and grand fountains, but the cities are pretty smelly, even with Roman sewers and aqueducts.
The other thing that people get wrong is because when you look at the Roman columns, they're all bleach white. They assume that they were white, but they were actually painted. They're just white because they've been out so long since somebody thought to paint them again on account of it all being dead.
One point, my protagonist thinks, boy, whoever thought that Romans loved pure white marble didn't know much about Romans. And he's looking at a chariot, and he says, that reminds me of a Costa Rican ox cart I saw once. If you've ever seen a Costa Rican ox cart, they're really gaudy.
I've seen them.
Romans loved bright primary colors. They slathered them on everything. And, like apical colored marble floors and wall-to-wall murals and mosaics. And
that's an interesting thought that just occurred to me when you mentioned the chariots. One of the things that Ford did when they were doing the Model T was the standardization feature allowed them to build things more quickly that used to be essentially bespoke vehicles. You could do that with a chariot and an assembly line, even with the technology back then, if you knew how to standardize things. Is that something they think to introduce?
Well, they've got to launch a lot of, one of the things that was included in the baggage is a lot of measuring gauges.
Right.
And that was actually one of the big impediments back then. Measuring things precisely was virtually impossible. So yeah, they do introduce some standardization, but the Romans did things like that. For example, they made mold stamped pottery in groups of 30 or 40,000 at a time. They've been discovered in the ruins of impoverished huts in northern Britain is apical pottery work from centralized factories. They didn't do that for everything, but they did it for some things, and they were thoroughly familiar with the concept.
Yeah, that's gives you a lot of room to play with. Do you have them go full native, or do they kind of cling to their, and if this is a spoiler, tell me so, or do they try to cling to their modern sensibilities? Because that'd be the hard thing for people to decide whether I'm going to go full native or not. And a lot of the isekai portal fantasy style stories, that's one of the big tropes. Do they go native right away, or do they fight it?
Bit of both, and differing between there's 5 of them, so they differ in that. Some are more enthusiastic about Roman times than others. There's a lot of stuff that would be really repulsive for a modern American,
right?
Crucifixions outside the gates, that sort of
slavery, the treatment of women, like all of that.
Yeah, although actually Rome was much better than ancient Greece as far as treatment of women was concerned.
It differentiated greatly by what class the woman was in. Obviously, the higher class, the more of a better life they had. It would.
Athenians more or less had kept their women in purda. Romans didn't. One of the things Greeks found shocking about Romans was that upper class women went to banquets and on parties and they ate with their men.
Right.
And they had, they weren't formally important in politics, but they certainly were influential.
Right.
And Roman women could own property in their own names and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of variation.
Was the cast that goes back with him the captain, or I'm assuming a captain, Arthur, and then his 4 compatriots, were they all male, or was it a co-ed group that goes back with him?
2 men, 2 women.
Does that factor in how they're treated on the other side, given that they're?
Yeah. Although they're regarded as a bit supernatural.
Yeah, you can see that.
Which helps. The Romans were superstitious. they were really superstitious, in a sort of disorganized way. And, well, read the book.
I plan on it. So you've talked about the grad students and the captain that goes back. Were there any secondary characters that were local to the time period that you liked writing? Obviously, you don't want to give any spoilers, but
Marcus Aurelius is a viewpoint character in a couple of chapters.
oh, nice.
The Jewish merchant they meet, Josephus. Josephus ben Matthias is how he refers to it in his own community, but he's Lucius Macius Josephus because he's a Roman citizen. You got a libellus, and it gave you a trinomen, a three-barreled name, which is what Romans usually used. When my hero and his compatriots finally get Roman citizenship, they get a libellus, and he picks their middle name as Triarius, which was an actual Roman middle name, but it also meant old soldier.
Okay. So that fits. Then people that had that would be a lot of the former legionnaires that got citizenship.
Yeah, and you inherited the middle name too. Oddly enough, Romans only used about 20 first names. Every fifth or fourth guy you'd meet would be called Marcus.
I didn't realize it was that limited. I'm not a subject matter expert on Rome. I just find it fascinating.
Yeah, there was the nomen, the the cognomen and the nomen. Yeah, the last one, the third name, it started out as a nickname, but then it became hereditary in families. And you can tell a lot about Romans by what those names actually meant. You know, in most cultures, names mean things. They're not just sounds.
Right.
In English, it's just an arbitrary sound, but that was because we adopted French and Latin and biblical-based names in the Middle Ages. But Roman names meant things like Cicero, Cicero, meant chickpea. But that was a colloquial phrase. It actually meant wart face. Brutus means animalistic stupidity. No, I'm not kidding.
Sounds like their names are the same way we do call signs.
Yeah,
not your finest moments.
Caesar meant hairy. There was another one that meant baldy. Names like that. And Sextius, which was a first name, meant sixth, which was what you were named if you were the sixth kid.
That's fascinating. Well,
German names at the time were things like a bold friend or kin protector or things like that.
And then the Roman tradition is sometimes if you did notable things, your names get changed to honor the notable thing. So like Scipio Africanus because he beat Hannibal in Africa.
Exactly.
Man, that'd be cool if you could cover that. But again, timelines are a thing. So is there anything we didn't ask? Because I could keep going because I'm having fun, but it's 2 hours in and, we record at 9, so it's 10:30 already. And I promised I would keep it shorter. So is there anything we didn't cover that you feel like we need to before we wrap this up?
Underwear.
One of the
shocks they get is adapting to Roman underwear. Sublilaculum. It's a sort of Roman loincloth. Both sexes wore it. And women wore a strophium, which was a cloth breastband, their equivalent of a bra. And it's a bit of a shock getting used to those.
I could see that, getting used to that. And then the materials are going to be probably rougher than they're used to.
Yeah, the very, very, very most expensive and finest materials would be roughly comparable to what we regard as standard.
Right.
Most cloth would be sort of lumpy and coarse, and most people didn't have enough clothing to wash it very often. The Romans washed themselves fairly often, but clothing, not so much unless you were wealthy and had a lot of it. And of course, you went to the baths, but so did everybody else, including people with communicable diseases.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. And then some of the toiletry standards, like the sponge on a stick and all of that. I shudder to think.
But also, Romans didn't have any sense of privacy about bodily functions. Their public latrines were really public. You just sat next to the person next to you. and talked and gossiped and that sort of thing.
So not a place to be gun shy.
They wrote on the walls.
Yeah. All right. So we're definitely gonna have to have you come back on a panel where we talk about applying like Roman and generally ancient history to speculative fiction, because I think there's room to have some fun.
Mm-hmm.
But if people wanted to follow you on the internet, where would they go to do that?
I'm on Facebook. There's a subgroup, the SM Stirling Appreciation Society. I didn't name it. And Stirling Spoilerific on Facebook. And I have a listserv that, talks about my books. No politics on the listserv or on the SM Stirling Appreciation Society. I occasionally indulge in that on Facebook in general. And I have a website, smstirling.com. It's got some fanfic, and I usually put up sample chapters of the book I'm working on. The first 10 chapters of this book are up on my website.
So do you have an estimated completion date for book 2?
I'm about halfway through, and I usually start slow and then write faster and faster. So that's probably going to be out about next year, about the same time.
Yeah, I know it's a slow, that's why I asked for your completion date and not their publication date, because there can sometimes be a long lag when you're going trad pub.
On that, some companies take years after you turn something in, others less so. Bain, 6 months, which is fast by industry standards.
We had I'm drawing a blank on her name. The lady that runs Bain, Tony Weisskopf. We had her on once, and we talked about it. And that was one she said, even as fast as they can be on the turnaround, which is why they'll sometimes release the ebooks first on their website, they're still at the mercy of the traditionally published printers when it comes to the print copies. I mean, having seen the comparative quality between those and what you get on print on demand, sometimes it's worth the wait if you want to read a book multiple times. So I'm not faulting that, but there are bottlenecks in the production that you just can't control.
Yeah, there are. And there's the copy editing process, and you never get all the spelling mistakes, no matter how many times you go through
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's always something through.
I have seen comments on books that I publish, and they're like, "That didn't look like this was even edited." I'm like, I went through 5 rounds of edits, and you caught the one misspelled word. Congratulations.
Yeah, I misspelled something in Latin in the first book. Oh God, I took such care. Oh well.
Well, if it's from the right POV, you can call it unreliable narrator and just move on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's the last question that I remember.
Speaking of Latin humor, do you know what Roman soldiers called catapults and throwing engines?
No.
Tormentum.
I like it.
It means throwing engine, catapult, field catapult, but it also means instrument of torture.
I can appreciate that. So one of the things that we've talked to, I mentioned to you in the pre-show, we've interviewed Mark Allen Idlehite, who took a more fantasy version of the Portal Fantasy where the Ninth Roman Legion ends up in the smack dab in the middle of Middle Earth. And one of the things he did is he used more modern rank structure because it was what people were familiar with. He got away with it by saying, well, it's been so many years since they came over, linguistic drift, and he moved on. Is that, obviously that's not going to happen when you're going back to the actual Roman time. So do you use their rank structure, or did you modernize it just for the ease of the reader?
I used the actual rank structure. Roman ranks weren't precisely equivalent to ours anyway. You had a century, which was a group of 80 men, basically. Small company, big platoon. It was commanded by a centurion. He had an optio, which was his second in command, and a tesserarius, who was the sort of like a junior sergeant or corporal. And then above centurion, you had each cohort, which was roughly equivalent to a battalion, had a series of more and more senior centurions. And the first centurion in the legion was the primus pilus, which translates more or less as first spear. And he was part of the legionary legate's command council, and he commanded the first century. but you moved up the centuries in seniority. So the first century was the elite, and the 10th century was the bottom of the heap. And Roman soldiers actually trained very extensively. They didn't let anyone actually operate unless they'd been training for 6 months to a year.
The training thing is what surprised me. They do a lot of it on the job training, but then they would have treated them almost like camp followers, if people are familiar with that term, until they passed standard. And they had standards for height. Weight wasn't really an issue because you had to be really rich to be fat. But they definitely, like, teeth were a requirement. You had to have so many of your teeth still there.
Yeah, they had a medical exam.
Yeah,
when you joined up, you had to get a letter of recommendation too, and you had to be above a certain height. I think it was about 5'5", which is actually 3 inches taller than Napoleon's army. And they examined you carefully.
The difference is the French inch was not the same as what we would call an inch today. So yes, technically Napoleon was 5'1", but if you translated it to what we would measure an inch, it's about 5'6".
Yeah, about 5'6". He wasn't short by the standards of the time.
No, but yeah, so they do that. Obviously, in crisis, in wartime, standards get lax no matter what your nation state is. But you got them there right before a war, so they would have been still the stricter.
Yeah, you spent 6 months pounding on a wooden stake with a wooden sword that was twice the normal weight, and a shield that was twice the normal weight, and doing 20-mile route marches and building camps. And Romans had a structure called instructors called capidoctores, and they were instructors in all the various arts that a soldier had to learn, not only weapons training and maneuvers, but things like building roads, building a camp every night. It was surprisingly thorough.
And they had the it's a string with a weight at the bottom of it, a plumb bob, I think it's called. Yeah, they're surprisingly able to be very accurate with those, given the lack of like GPS satellites and all that. It's amazed me when you look at some of the ancients, what they're able to do, that we would think, well, they didn't have computers. How do they do that? And they're doing it all in their head. Yeah.
Well, Roman surveyors could lay out a straight road along the closest distance between 2 points. And Romans overbuilt everything. That's why we still have their roads and some of their buildings. Roman law was very strict on liability. If a building fell down, you were in serious trouble if you built it. So they tended to just do it by rule of thumb and then overbuild it by about 4 or 5 times. And there's a program on YouTube. No, not YouTube, Amazon, walking the Roman roads of Britain. And they're still under most of the highways that connect British cities because they were laid out along the best routes.
I mean, we still build cars to Roman chariot standards and trains because the civilians made their carts the same size as the chariots, because otherwise you're bouncing around up and down the ruts. Yep. So it was better to standardize to the Romans, so that way you stayed in the ruts, smoother ride. And as that progressed forward, I mean, I've seen someone make the argument that the space race was affected by the Roman road structure, because you have to build things to fit on the back of 18-wheelers traveling down roads, designed essentially the width of a Roman chariot.
Yeah, and that's why our railroads are mostly 4 foot 8.5 inches between the rails.
Yep, it's fascinating, the long arm of history, which could be another series in this world, because you've now essentially changed the timeline. You could plug it forward in increments with new sets of characters and have it be vastly different because you've changed history. And it could be fascinating to watch how that plays out versus what we know of the real world or modern history, real history, I guess.
They make changes. Marcus Aurelius probably died of ulcers, and ulcers are caused by bacteria. So you just slip him some antibiotics and the ulcers clear up.
I didn't know that. Interesting. I know the antibiotics would revolutionize, everything for them as far as longevity and even childbirth.
They can't make antibiotics. They can do antiseptics, but antibiotics would require technology that won't be available for some time. That's one of those tools to build the tools to build the tools things.
Right.
So they keep that fairly secret, because if you had magic pills that would cure diseases that people are dying of all the time, you would be in deep trouble if people knew it.
And you didn't share, and then when you couldn't reproduce it, they're going to assume nefarious intent.
Yeah, exactly. So they keep it a deep dark secret. But of course, they need them themselves because, as I said, their immune systems are not used to the local wildlife.
Had you coordinated that with any kind of microbiologist to figure out how long that would take them to develop those immunities? I don't actually know the answer, so I'm curious.
It would take months to years. That's one of the things I found disturbing about a lot of time travel stories is that people don't catch things. We've gotten spoiled, even with the pandemic. We don't think about infectious disease the way people did in the interval between discovering germs and getting antibiotics. Like my mother grew up in the 20s and 30s in Peru, and one of the people she knew died of the bubonic plague, and another died of rabies caught from a bat. She had a thing about bats ever
I
after.
can believe it.
And she was much more careful about touching things than people of our generation or later, of my generation or later. I'm a boomer, born in 53, because it was more difficult to avoid infection and there was less you could do about it. So, but most of the drop in mortality between early 19th century times and the time I was born in the 1950s wasn't due to antibiotics. It was due to sanitation. Once they knew about germs, sanitation followed. And that cut disease rates and infant mortality rates by enormous factors. And it wasn't anything high tech. It was just being very, very careful about keeping clean, about not letting flies get on your food, that sort of thing.
They did a study where they broke down like the mortality rates, and everyone thinks that they died so young. But when you take out the infant mortality, if you made it to about 5, you're as likely to live to 80 then as you are now.
Yeah, you stood a good chance of living into your 70s. That's why 70 is the biblical years of man. If you made it to adulthood, you stood a pretty good chance of reaching 70. But there was a chance of you dying in any particular time. Infectious disease was the primary cause of death, and it isn't anymore. Now we die of cancer and that sort of thing.
It'd be interesting. I'm curious. I'm definitely going to read it. But as we wrap this up, because if I let us keep going, we'll get to hour 3 and your publisher will be mad at me because your book will be late. It'll be a thing. You can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, and the Twitters. We have our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com for professional purposes only, people. We have our Facebook group and Facebook page. And more importantly, we have Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and email. For all the shenanigans, send them her way. We have our website over on Spotify, but it's a bunch of gobbledygook. Trust me, when they bought Anchor FM, it's a bunch of convoluted nonsense. So go to the Linktree, find us on our website over on Spotify, and you can help support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Or you can support the show more directly over at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee until they go into a caffeinated coma. I don't know if that's a thing, but we're going to try and see if we can make it happen, people. Links in the show notes, code podcast grunts, get you 10% off. And who doesn't love a good deal? And with that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you, Stirling, for coming on. This was a lot of fun. I'm definitely going to read the book. You sold me on it. Of course, the cover in Rome had me from the beginning, but I read a book when I was younger called A Boy Rides with Hannibal, and it was basically the idea of looking at ancient history through the lens of kids your age who are living it. I have been looking forever for that book for my kids, and I can't find it on the internet. I know that I read it, but if you heard of it, people, send me an email. I will love you forever. But yeah, it's a fascinating time. So I'm excited to see what you did.
Okay.
All right. And with that, people, we are out. And boom.